Raya Salter. I'm a climate and energy attorney and the founder and executive director of the Energy Justice Law and Policy Center. Welcome to today's program, Economy Meets Ecology, Redefining Growth for a Sustainable Future. It's my pleasure to be with you today with our distinguished guests, who we will hear from shortly. First, I want to extend my gratitude to the International Society for Ecological Economics for their support and encouragement of these programs, and also bring in the memory of Mr. Stuart Scott, who was the heart and soul of Facing Future TV before his untimely passing shortly before the Glasgow COP. So why ecological economics? Why is it so important to talk about this topic now? So as this COP focuses on finance, and we're engaged in discussions on how markets and economic incentives can help us reach our urgent goals, we need to avert the climate crisis, and here's the thing. Traditional economics often overlooks the critical connection between our planet's health and the economic systems that we rely on. That's why it's critical to engage and examine in ecological economics, a discipline that is reshaping the way we think about our environment and our economies. So to set the stage just a bit more, ecological economics seeks to understand the relationships between nature, society, and the economy. It's not just about profit and loss. It's also about sustainability, equality, justice, and preserving our planet for generations to come. We need to think about what it means to redefine economic success. Traditional metrics like GDP have long guided policy, often overlooking environmental cost. Extractive practices and overconsumption have pushed our planet to the brink. These are the root causes of the climate crisis, and here at COP28, we must be thinking about alternatives. We also need to make sure that we look at it at the nexus of gender, indigeneity, race, and impacts on the global south. So let's go ahead and turn to our panelists, who are the thought leaders here. We are joined today by Dr. Debbie Lay, who is a lead author of Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change Special Report on Global Warming at 1.5 degrees C. She has a PhD in Geography and the Environment from the Environmental Change Institute of the University of Oxford. Her work includes a focus on equity, energy, and gender at the nexus of climate and adaptation. We'll also be joined by Dr. Cindy Eisenhower, a professor of anthropology and climate change at the University of Maine. She's an ecological and economic anthropologist. She studies how culture impacts production and consumption, including examining how markets can enable inequitable environmental impacts and how we can shift towards more sustainable economies. So welcome, Dr. Lay and Dr. Eisenhower. So first, I'd like to turn to you, Dr. Lay. You're a lead author of the IPCC report, our guidebook on, what we need to do. And how we need to change our systems if we're to adapt to a warming world. So why are economic systems important as we work to reach the IPCC's goals, and how must our systems change? And are there considerations we need to think of with regard to gender and equity?
Yes, good afternoon. Thank you very much, Raya, for the invitation. So IPCC's, sixth assessment cycle from the special report of global warming to 1.5 degrees C to working groups 2 and 3 point out to 5 system transitions, which are land, ocean, marine, coastal ecosystems, urban and settlements and infrastructure, energy, industry, and societal. And this is because there's this increasing realization that we need to work jointly on mitigation and adaptation. That is, we can't keep them separately. The degree of adaptation depends on the degree of global warming we have. So in working through system transitions and not in sectors, we are able to better analyze synergies and trade-offs between mitigation and adaptation, but also with the Sustainable Development Goals and with the protection of biodiversity. As you rightly mentioned, we need to think not only of human well-being, but also of ecosystem health, mainly because of all the ecosystem services we receive and the impact that losing them will have on human well-being. So when we talk about cost, it's not just the cost of what does a mitigation or an adaptation response cost or a specific project, but we also need to consider the costs of inaction. For example, maladaptation that we have so many examples of. What is the cost of not necessarily undoing the maladaptation, but on increasing the resilience of communities who've already been maladapted, or of ecosystems? But also, for example, injustice or increased poverty, when these synergies, or mainly trade-offs, aren't considered and addressed. So system transitions really look at these interdependencies, and that we can't keep working in these sectoral silos. So getting more specifically to your question, the fifth system transition that was developed in depth in the Working Group's 2 report on impacts, vulnerability, and adaptation is societal transitions. And it's on how do we all interact within arenas of engagement. This means that as a society, each and every one of us have different spaces in which we interact, be it spaces like this, at the COP, at different town halls, or doing research, or doing activism. So there are different areas in which all of us can interact. And of course, one of those is also the economic and financial arena. And trying to change the power dynamics of who makes decisions and how they're made, and how the most vulnerable and marginalized are also included in that decision making. So here we answer the question of, for example, gender. What role do women have in projects that directly impact gender and are supposed to improve it? So something else we did in the 6th assessment cycle is the multidimensional feasibility assessment. Usually projects only look at the economic and technological dimensions. Is a project cost effective? Is the technology robust? But when we talk about, for example, maladaptation and injustices, it's mainly in most occasions because we overlook social, cultural, and institutional dimensions, and some environment ones like biodiversity. So in looking at social cultural dimension, for example, we look at what is the social cultural acceptability? What are impacts on intergenerational equity? Do we worsen them or improve them? Or what about gender equity? So we factor all these indicators into how feasible and effective can an option be. And if we talk, for example, about institutions, it's like, what are the regulations and policies that we need? Are there regulations and policies in place to support the options? Or is there political acceptability? And how do you reach that? So when we talk about how you need to transform the economic system, is in looking at all these other components. It's not just in the hardware and in saying something is cost effective. Is how do you involve the people that are going to be affected, and how you look at, for example, perceptions and expectations. And there is really robust evidence that there are many options that are feasible. We also have evidence of where the main gaps are, like on social, cultural, or institutional dimensions. But these gaps or barriers doesn't mean we need to stay away from something. It points us to where there are problems that need to be solved, and that's where investments need to be made. So I'll leave it at that for now. Thank you.
Thank you. That's fascinating. And it's interesting the way the report really seeks to look at all the facets, of who we are really, and how that can come together to sort of holistically create the change that we need. Thank you so much for that. So, Dr. Eisenhower, you study how culture and markets intersect. So in other words, we got ourselves into this mess. What can we do to shift towards, tell us more about this, and what can we do to shift towards more sustainable systems?
Okay, well, first, thank you so much for having me, Raya, for the invitation. I appreciate it, and I'm very honored to be on the same panel with Deb. So Deb, great to meet you, and thanks for your work. So I think coming at this from the perspective of an anthropologist, I think one of the most important questions to ask to start to move towards that transition is, what's an economy for? Right? What is it for? What do we do with it? And it's really a system of provision to meet our basic needs. And I think if we can move back toward that type of a framing, I think we can move toward a system that is really designed for well-being, human well-being. So I have 4 points in terms of what I think might need to happen for us to move in that direction. So the first one is a bit critical of some of our dominant perspectives here, which, as Deb alluded to, oftentimes tend to be directed into one sector and highly technological, right? And so we have a lot of a focus on energy efficiency and transitions toward alternative energies. Don't get me wrong, that's absolutely necessary, 100%, but it's insufficient because we're attempting to use a technological fix for a problem that is at its very root sociocultural and economic, right? It's in the heart of our system. And a big part of the reason why that's important is because we have now robust evidence that when we take these technological fixes, they oftentimes result in unintended consequences. They oftentimes result in rebound effects where we actually end up with net increases in emissions and consumption, which is just horribly ironic. And they can oftentimes result in maladaptation, right, to actually increase poverty for those who are most vulnerable. So my perspective is that we've got to move away from those technological fixes, move toward a much more holistic understanding of a system, and to think about connecting production side policy with supply side policy so that we're looking at the whole system as a whole. So my work is really focused on how do we fix these deeply inequitable economic systems by looking at the whole chain of production, consumption, disposal, and recognizing that the systems as they exist are very much rooted in and perpetuated by colonialism, current and past. And it's that system that enables the burdens to be shifted into places where people can't resist, and for the accumulation in that system to be concentrated among the affluent. And so I think, and this is not just a matter of equity. Of course it is equity, but my contention is that it's this inequitable system that actually drives unsustainable levels of production and consumption, right? So in order to address the unsustainable production consumption, we have to address inequity in the system. The next point is that in the context of ensuring the right to development and a fair share of the remaining carbon budget, we have to reduce resource use and emissions in the global north, right? That's a given, and I don't think we can do it just through transitions to fossil fuels, right? We're still going to have biodiversity loss. We're still going to have atrocious levels of toxicity unless we address the kind of overall, resource use and the exceeding of planetary boundaries. So I can't claim to have the solutions for how do we facilitate the mass transfers of wealth that are going to be necessary. I hope that some of our negotiators are working that right now. But I can say, and my last point is that I think we actually have some really great solutions emerging. Like this, I think it's very hopeful in terms of some of the things that have been happening in the global north and highly affluent countries to try to transition away from high consumption lifestyles. And these are concepts that range from consumption corridors and the concept of plenitude or donut economics, right, where you think or degrowth perspectives even, which all of them share this emphasis on putting an upper level on consumption in the interest of being able to raise the minimum standard for human well-being so that we have an economy where everybody can achieve their best potential. So those are my brief intro thoughts.
Is this about, you talked about these different types of systems, donut economics, plenitude. Is this about capitalism versus not capitalism or socialism, or, is that what this is about, or is it something different?
I would say yes and no. I think yes in that the capitalist system has, at its very kind of design, a growth-based mindset, right? So we, through our metrics, through GDP, through the way that we put together our NACE codes and track industry development, we have a certain way that we associate with value, and it has to do with productivism, this idea that value is generated through the production of new products and services, right? And one of the things that I've been working on, and in fact, my most recent work is all around this idea of questioning productivism, and is that necessary? For example, might we find real empowering economic value in distributive labor? So in the work that goes into recognizing the values and the resources that we have and redistributing them in a way that generates additional value. So there's a problem with the growth mindset, I think, for sure. And of course, a lot of folks would argue, and I would oftentimes align myself with them, is that capitalism has a very colonial nature to it, all right? And so that's a problem, yes. But I do think that there has always been resource extraction, there has always been oppression in different types of systems. So I'm not necessarily sure that there's one type of economic system that, but I do think that, in moving forward, there might be multiple possibilities for how we can achieve that kind of bottom line protection and a cap on the top. I think that I really do think that there are multiple ways to head that direction.
So it's about political economy more than, say, one particular system.
Yeah, and I think it's also about political will.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's an excellent point. Dr. Lay, could you, I hear this word used, maladaptation. Maybe you could explain to folks what maladaptation means and what it means.
So maladaptation is when instead of reducing vulnerability, we increase vulnerability, or, for example, through destroying ecosystems permanently. The most common example of this are seawalls. When they're not done properly, we have the enormous risk, and it has already happened, of damaging coastal areas in which then you cannot do, for example, any type of fishing, or populations then have to move or migrate. Maladaptation also happens when you create an imbalance in power dynamics, or when part of the population, for example, ends up with higher levels of poverty, or you have injustices against people in extreme poverty, or because of gender or race. And maladaptation happens for a number of reasons. One of them, there's not enough funding, and you focus, as you just said, on technology and not on the whole social-cultural aspect. It happens also when you look at very short time frames. Adaptation doesn't happen from a day to the next. Adaptation needs a certain time frame in which you can see if the adaptation project is doing its intended work and how it can evolve, like adaptation pathways. And when that not is done, and when you don't do follow-up and monitoring, then you can also lead to maladaptation. So if you say, I'm going to fund an adaptation project and only fund it for 6 months, there is a high likelihood that you'll end up in maladaptation, or, as I mentioned earlier, when you don't consider synergies and trade-offs. So for example, when you talk about an agricultural project, like say adaptation, that project in and of itself is not independent of other actions that you do, for example, in water and in forests, and if you have populations nearby, it will also impact. So not taking those connections into account is what can also lead to maladaptation, which is why this system thinking is so important. Many times we don't address trade-offs because we don't know they're there, because we think, oh, the technology is robust and this is cost-effective and this is something we should do. So it's more of the overlooking. Sometimes it's completely unintended, but it happens.
No, thank you for that. How does the IPCC report seek to guide us towards the value add of including these perspectives that you talk about?
What we found in the report is that when you look at synergies, the added value of considering these add-ons is smaller compared to doing separate independent projects, especially when you consider the cost of an action, or of the cost of all these maladaptations that happen, or when you don't consider the trade-offs. But there's two things I wanted to highlight based on this previous conversation. One of them is indigenous knowledge. That indigenous knowledge was very prominently highlighted in AR6, because not only because its importance, but also because we have a lot to learn. It's not just Western science that should guide what adaptation actions should come, but also indigenous knowledge. And when you mentioned values, it made me think this is not of IPCC, but it's of IPBES, the Intergovernmental Panel on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, that a couple years ago released their values assessment that looks at different values and worldviews, focusing, of course, on non-monetary values. And I think that's something that we increasingly need to incorporate. When IPCC talks about climate resilient development, part of climate resilient development is how you incorporate different types of worldviews. and knowledges. And that is important because how an economic system values water or forests or biodiversity is very different to different indigenous knowledges. So like if we talk about the Mayans in Central America, like in Guatemala, you talk about Mayan cosmovision, and it's that whole relationship you have with nature. It's not only that I respect nature, but it's the relationship you forge with nature. So for example, when you inaugurate a project, before you break ground on a project, they do this Mayan ceremony on asking permission of Mother Earth to break ground. And then after you break it, you ask, you do another ceremony, for example, to give thanks, or ask apologies for any disturbances that you created in the process. You know, and those things isn't just something extra that, oh, you add to community participation or something. It's something that is really inherent in the process, and that should be organic, especially when working with indigenous communities. But the main point here of values is not in just considering it, but how we also assimilate other worldviews into how we work, because that's another component of how you transform the economic systems.
Oh, thank you. That's really fascinating. If I could ask you also, as an anthropologist who also studies economics, what are your thoughts about how bringing in additional worldviews, points of views, folks from different places actually adds value to economic systems?
Okay. Yes, I think, well, okay, if I can address it in a slightly different way than you asked it at first. I would love to just say, I think one of the reasons that I love being an economic anthropologist is because we look at diversity in economic systems, right? And I think a lot of us tend to think that we are inevitably in this economic system that we're in now. And when you look at the diversity that has existed in economic form over time and across geography, it's really hopeful and enabling, right? Because we understand that this is an inevitable system. This is something we constructed. This is something built by people, and it can be reconstructed and rebuilt by people, right? In response to our environment. So there's something really hopeful. So it brings that value, I think. But in relation to Deb's comments, that's the great thing about non-traditional economics, non-neoclassical economics, is that ecological economics and institutional economics, resource economics, really can help us to think through the non-market-based values that are associated with the goods and services that people use, including forest products and oceans and rivers, and can help us to kind of broaden our framework so that we can adapt in ways that improve the chances for people having well-being in their economies and to sustainable livelihoods.
That is so interesting, and it definitely makes me want to follow up. Certainly in academic circles, activist circles, political circles, you hear folks, what do you mean you're challenging, capitalism or the way, and ism and the way that things work right now? And I hear you saying that, hey, no, actually, we've done things in a lot of different ways. Could you give us some examples of how these different systems that can give us hope that we can change?
Yeah, I mean, I think that there are systems that are based in strong notions of reciprocity, right, with other people and also with nature, right, and living in relation with others that we could certainly learn from and integrate into our models even, right? How do we start to value things in a slightly different way? And in terms of policies, right, even contemporary policies, there are policies that make small little shifts in how we consume and how we behave, but there are other policies that have, I think, the potential to really start to move the needle in more transformative ways. And the one that I alluded to earlier was kind of this rethinking of value in terms of distributive labor, which really connects well into the idea of a just transition.
Explain what you mean by that for those who may not be economists. What does it mean to change how you think about distributive labor?
Well, okay, so as I was saying earlier, the kind of dominant capitalist frame associates value with the production of new goods and services, right? I mean, if you look at how we calculate GDP, a TV is gone from our calculation after 3 months, right? It's not there anymore. But we have things, we have value that still exists. And so what I'm proposing is that if we can start to think about what is the value that's generated when you move those things, and what are the jobs that are available, the sources of livelihood that are available for people who do that, right? Who partake in what we would call distributive forms of labor.
Okay, thank you very much for that. I'd like to go ahead and open it up for a question or two from the audience. Does someone have a question for Dr. Eisenhower or Dr. Lay? I see any hands? Yes? All right, we seem to have a hand. Oh, wait, I think they're going to bring you a microphone.
Yeah, maybe this is just semantics, but I teach a course at the Aravi Institute for Environmental Studies on environmental economics, and I noticed that you used, I think, the phrase ecological economics. So are you making any kind of differentiation? Is there some differentiation between those two?
Actually, may I toss that question to you?
I'm an anthropologist, as we said at the top of the. But I typically, at least as I understand it, and I'm sure that there could be maybe some ecological economists in the room, but I think the discipline tends to think of itself as ecological economics. But I guess I would say that maybe the ecological side attempts to take a little bit more of a systems-based approach.
Maybe just in a few seconds, where are some of the places at the COP you think that, in these negotiations right now, where we might be making some progress in this area?
Well, I would hope in the global goal of adaptation, because we've done a series of workshops over the last year or year and a half where IPCC has been asked to provide scientific input. I've participated in quite a few of these GJA workshops, for example, talking about indicators. So that's a space where I would hope to see some. And of course, you all know of the Loss and Damage Fund, which I think is another important area that even though, for example, I'm talking about adaptation, I think we all need to ask ourselves the question of, are we acting fast enough to avoid reaching limits?
Yeah.
That would then lead us to losses and damages. So
And I think that is fantastic, and that's a great place to leave it. Thank you so much, and thank you for watching Facing Future TV.